Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Tuesday, everybody. This is a big episode today. We have a lot to cover, so let's begin. Yesterday, Monday, 8 government bodies, namely the People's Bank of China, the State Administration of Financial Regulation, China Securities Regulatory Commission, State Administration of Foreign Exchange, National Development and Reform Commission, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, the Ministry of Finance, and the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce published 25 more measures to help improve business confidence in the country. This tells us 2 things immediately. 1, Beijing is still deeply concerned with the trend for its economy, and 2, the many measures already rolled out over the last several months have not had the desired effect. It's becoming much harder for Beijing to simply signal support to the private sector to get economic activity. The government departments issued the notice to support the development of the private economy with monetary policy tools, credits, bonds and equity financing, and foreign exchange. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai writes that in terms of credit, financial institutions should increase financial support for private enterprises and gradually raise the proportion of loans to private enterprises. Moreover, financial institutions should also reasonably raise the tolerance of non-performing loans of private enterprises and establish and improve the due diligence exemption mechanism for loans towards private companies. The notice also calls for unblocking the bond financing channels for private enterprises. State-run The Global Times writes, quote, "The most important aspect of the notice released on Monday is that it sets clear targets and crucial areas, guide banks and other financial institutions to offer sustainable financing for private businesses," end quote. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin writes that overall this notice reiterates the key support directions previously proposed by financial regulatory authorities. These include further increasing support for key areas such as technological innovation, specialized, refined, distinctive and new enterprises, green and low carbon initiatives, and industrial base reconstruction projects, as well as for private, small and micro enterprises. In related news, we also note that UK-based Reuters, in an exclusive report published yesterday, that the Beijing Stock Exchange has de facto implemented a new policy that prevents major shareholders of companies listed on it from selling stocks. Quote, "Worried that such sales could dance a long-desired rally," end quote. The market's benchmark 50 index has surged 46% this month on the back of recent measures by authorities. Quote, "These include lowering the amount of funds an investor must have in their stock account to invest, improving trading mechanisms, and encouraging mutual funds to participate in the market," end quote. But evidently it also appears that it's due to not letting major players sell stocks. If true, it is certainly not healthy or sustainable. Will all these new measures work? On this question, one commentator expressed today, quote, "Whether these measures improve confidence remains to be seen, but at some point all this policy support for the private sector has to start showing results, doesn't it?" End quote. We remember that these moves come hot off the heels of news that regulators are working on a draft list of firms eligible for bank support, while weighing a plan for lenders to offer developers unsecured loans for the first time. This is on top of a recent order for the banks to roll out local government debt at favorable terms to avert a crisis in that $9 trillion market. Of course, with any system, adjustments in one area result in changes in another. The concern with forcing banks to lend when it doesn't make much business sense to do so hurts profits and exacerbates pressures in the financial system. Indeed, Bloomberg economists warn in a piece today that China's escalating push to have its banking behemoths backstop struggling property firms is adding to a maelstrom of woes for the $57 trillion sector. In an accompanying piece, the US outlet writes that already stung by soaring bad loans and record low net interest margins, lenders such as the massive Industrial and Commercial Bank of China Limited may soon be asked for the first time to provide unsecured loans to developers, many of whom are in default or teetering on the brink of collapse. Quote, "The risky lifeline threatens to exacerbate an already bleak outlook. ICBC and 10 other major banks may next year need to set aside an additional $89 billion for bad real estate debt, or 21% of estimated pre-provisions profits in 2024. Lenders are now weighing lowering growth targets and cutting jobs among possible options, according to at least a dozen bankers who asked not to be named discussing internal matters." End quote. One case cited in the report demonstrates just how concerning this all is. At one local branch at a major lender in Sichuan province, about 80% of new corporate loans this year were extended to increasingly risky local government financing vehicles. In response to the recent requirement for banks to step up financing for builders, both Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan have warned, quote, "This is a risky move," end quote, in the words of the latter. A recent S&P Global Ratings report warned that in 2024 alone, banks could suffer a capital hit from bad lending of 2.2 trillion yuan, $301 billion. Though perhaps self-interest will ultimately prevent Beijing pushing the banks too far. Quote, "It's unlikely that banks will be asked to save the property sector or local government financing vehicles at any cost. After all, the big banks are all owned by the central government, and they are a key source of fiscal income," end quote. Nevertheless, it does feel like there is intense policy debate among policymakers, and this is resulting in confused policy rollout. Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis expressed on this today, quote, "It seems that policy strategies are still very unclear. One day, regulators call on financial institutions to reduce risk and improve risk management techniques, and then the next day they call on them to increase their tolerance of non-performing loans." End quote. Hey everyone, if you're getting some value from today's video, I have a big favor to ask, and this is consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification. 50% of regular viewers currently are not subscribed to the channel, and this is the main way the channel grows, which allows me to put more time into it and make it better for all of you going forward, and all it takes is a few clicks of the mouse. My promise is that as the channel grows, I will allocate more resources into it. The hope is one day this can be allocated my full-time hours. And for anyone who wants to go the extra mile and help keep the channel financially sustainable, this is of course also critical for the channel. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This channel is primarily supported by subscriber support rather than corporate support, and I want to keep it that way. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Next up, let's have a quick update on the respiratory illness outbreak, which we've been following for several days now. The World Health Organization and global experts, many of which are likely skeptical of official Chinese health statements, are watching the situation very closely. And the scenes of hospitals overcrowded with sick children is of course very disquieting. Fortunately, so far it does not appear to be the beginning of an outbreak of a new disease. A spokesman for the National Health Commission said that influenza is one of the main causes of the spike in cases, as well as other pathogens. The official explanation is that one key reason behind the prevalence of respiratory diseases this winter, which seems more noticeable than in previous years, is due to the rise of an so-called immunity gap, resulting from a decrease in antibodies against these pathogens among the general public. Yesterday, the National Health Commission said that the flu peak may last another 1 or 2 weeks, and thus the situation should ease a little after that. Indeed, over the weekend, the acting director of the WHO's Department of Epidemic and Pandemic Preparedness and Prevention said the increase in cases, quote, appeared to be driven by a rise in the number of children contracting pathogens that they had avoided during 2 years of COVID restrictions. End quote. Singapore-based infectious disease physician Long Ho Nam, speaking to US-based media outlet The Wall Street Journal, expressed something similar, saying, quote, North America went through this last year, and children in China are going through it now. They've lost their fighting immunity, not just to COVID, but to other viruses as well. End quote. While, if true, this is a relief, the strain on healthcare resources in of itself is also concerning. To prevent an overwhelming influx of patients to hospitals, Chinese state media has advised parents to seek medical attention at a hospital only for sick infants under 3 months of age, displaying clear signs of fever. For other children, medical attention should only be sought if a high fever persists for 3 to 5 days. With memories of the first few months of the pandemic still painfully fresh in many minds, health authorities around the world will continue to watch these developments closely. Next up, and finally for today, in Myanmar, as fighting intensifies on the border with Yunnan, the People's Liberation Army's Southern Theatre Command has started live fire exercises on the Chinese side. A full unpacking of the situation in Myanmar and the geopolitical considerations for Beijing is a task for another future video. For today, we covered the basic outline of the complex situation on the ground, the PLA actions, as well as some commentary. It appears that Myanmar's military junta has lost control of substantial sections of the country's border with China in recent days, as forces fighting the coup regime have coordinated their attacks. One Myanmar armed group even seized a China-Myanmar border crossing. Local media reports too that more than 100 cargo trucks were destroyed in an attack on junta troops guarding another border gate to China in northern Shan state last week. Over the weekend, the PLA Southern Theatre Command announced live fire drills and training exercises along the Chinese side of the China-Myanmar border, saying they are, quote, decisive and aimed at safeguarding Chinese sovereignty, stability of border area, and safety of personnel from impacts caused by the civil war in Myanmar, rather than to act to intervene in the internal affairs of the neighboring country. End quote. Zhu Zhenming, a professor at the Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences, told the state-run Global Times on Sunday that the drills, quote, will reassure people on the Chinese side of the border, and it is also a message to the conflicting parties in Myanmar that they should try their best to avoid damaging the border security, as well as the safety of Chinese communities near border regions, end quote, adding, quote, the fights between them are not our business, but China will not allow any shell or bullet to be fired across the border and harm Chinese people. We also oppose any force within Myanmar to use China to serve their interests to fight other parties, end quote. The same state media piece expressed, quote, some armed forces in Myanmar claimed that they are conducting telecom fraud for China and are attempting to persuade others that China is supporting them in their fight against the Myanmar government. This is not true at all, end quote. This is an interesting point. Whenever state media denies something, it's worth looking into at least. There has been a lot of speculation that Beijing has been using proxies in Myanmar to destroy the telecom fraud bases that have been victimizing so many PRC citizens in recent years. In a note published over the weekend, the US government-funded think tank, the United States Institute of Peace, said that the immediate aim of the combined offensive in the border region of Myanmar was to shut down lucrative criminal activity in enclaves along the Chinese frontier that are run by military-sponsored border guard forces. Significantly, quote, in doing so, the insurgents took advantage of China's recent efforts to stifle scams run from the enclaves that target Chinese citizens. This could mark a turning point in the national struggle against military rule, one that would pose serious new challenges to the anti-coup leadership, the international community, and Myanmar's neighbors. End quote. In a piece published yesterday with US-based outlet The Diplomat, research fellow at the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, David Hutt, writes, quote, Beijing appears to be undergoing a rethink about the junta. Indeed, the offensive hit some of the cyber scam outfits that are operated by junta-backed cronies, mostly border guard forces, and particularly those in Kokang region. Beijing will look favorably upon the Three Brotherhood Alliance if it can put an end to those criminal enterprises, not least since the junta has ignored Beijing's calls to crack down on the border guard forces. End quote. However, this sort of talk may have struck a nerve for some in Beijing. On Monday, state-run Global Times published a special editorial called West US once again make amateur remarks about PLA Southern Theater Command's border drills. In the piece, the editors express, quote, "They have used their own diplomatic yardstick to measure China's every move. Some have even linked the drills to the recent joint crackdown on telecom fraud by the two countries. Anyone familiar with and having an understanding of China-Myanmar relations know how absurd, baseless and amateur these conclusions are. China does pay close attention to the conflict in northern Myanmar and has repeatedly urged all parties in Myanmar to immediately cease fire and stop the fighting. In short, China's principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries has always been consistent, and its resolute attitude in safeguarding national security and regional stability is also very clear." End quote. Evidently, not everyone agrees, however. Burmese media outlet Irrawaddy reports that on Sunday, quote, "Myanmar regime-backed nationalists staged their first protest against the Chinese government outside Yangon City Hall and the Chinese embassy in Yangon, accusing China of backing an ethnic alliance that has been delivering heavy defeats against regime troops in northern Shan State. Members of the Patriotic Monks Union and Myanmar Nationalist Organization took part in the protest outside Yangon City Hall, accusing Beijing of destroying Myanmar by selling weapons to ethnic armed organizations based near the border in northern Myanmar." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.